at weddings where Muslim women have been present, I am sometimes asked by them, when it says one man and one woman for life, do you really mean that? Because, of course, they always live under the threat of divorce. So the idea that there is here a permanent relationship that is being created is seen by them as good news.
Good everyone, and welcome to the Thomas More Centre channel. My name is Mark Makivetsky, and today it's my pleasure to be interviewing Monsignor Michael Nazir-Ali. Monsignor is a former Anglican bishop who, upon his conversion to Catholicism in 2021, was ordained a Catholic priest for the Ordinariate of Walsingham. Monsignor, welcome to the channel.
Thank you very much. It's good to see you.
It's great to see you too. Thanks so much for joining us. So, Monsignor, you were born in Pakistan and your father came to Christianity from Shia Islam. You then came to personal faith in Christ at about the age of 15, and eventually you ended up serving as a priest and a bishop in Pakistan. Can you tell us about the challenges you faced being a Christian in Pakistan and the challenges they still face there today?
Yes, this is a long story, of course, but Christians actually supported the creation of Pakistan because they felt that the Muslims who had been a minority in British India would treat another minority well if they got their own nation. And they were promised a great deal at the time, but the promises have not been fulfilled. And the story has been of greater and greater marginalization and greater persecution as it is now. Not always by the government, but by extremists of one kind or another. And governments have been pressurized into making laws that have encouraged extremism. So that is the situation. We have today mob attacks on Christian churches, including Catholic churches, very recently, and mobs attacking individuals who are suspected of blasphemy or desecration of the Holy Book of Islam and things like that. So the situation remains very, very critical, and people's prayers are needed for the Christians and Christian churches in that land.
And regarding the blasphemy laws, you have a background in Islamic jurisprudence. You've studied it, haven't you? And could you tell us a bit about the situation of when a Christian's accused of breaching the blasphemy law, how disadvantaged they are when it comes to being in court?
Yes, so far, of course, no one has actually suffered the death penalty. They've been convicted of it, but no one has so far, thank God, been executed for it. And many people are, in fact, acquitted because the cases against them have been taken out because of personal motives, jealousy, or land, or jobs, or whatever it may be. But of course, this may not last forever. And there will come a time when someone is executed for this alleged crime. My point has always been that I've been told since I was a child by my friends and relatives that the Prophet of Islam, when he was insulted, forgave those who insulted him. And it is incumbent, of course, on Muslims to follow his practice. So if that is the case, in what sense is this law even Islamic, let alone conforming to international law and to human rights legislation in Pakistan itself?
I was thinking we might switch gears to ecumenical concerns, because you've also had a lot of experience in the ecumenical space. So part of the motivation for getting in touch was I've encountered a lot of people and they seem to think that ecumenism is a matter of Christian groups kind of papering over their differences and agreeing to get along. And On one set of people think that that's a great thing, and other people dismiss ecumenism entirely because that's what they think it is. So I was hoping you could tell us a bit about the differences between true and false ecumenism.
Yes, I mean, there can be kissy ecumenism of the kind you're talking about, where people meet and gloss over differences with a desire to get on. I have come across that. But actually, since the entry of the Roman Catholic Church into the ecumenical movement after the Second Vatican Council, there's been some very rigorous ecumenical work done, which is not of the papering over kind. So, for example, I mean, to take an important example, the work done by the Lutherans and the Catholic Church on justification by faith was very vigorous. It took into account all Catholic teaching and also the best of what the Lutherans believed, and produced an agreement which I think is robust. It's it's not an agreement about everything, but it's an agreement about the main things that divided people at the time of the Reformation. I think that's a considerable achievement. Similarly, the Anglican Roman Catholic dialogue, which began after the Second Vatican Council, did not evade any issues, or did not evade many issues, perhaps one should say. And the agreement was rigorous. I think the problem uh, with ARCIC, the Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission, was that as soon as we arrived at an agreement, say, about the Christian ministry, the nature of the Christian ministry, the Anglican Communion then went and did something that was the opposite of it. And this frustrated the Catholic Church. Quite understandably, we had a number of popes trying to intervene, saying, please don't do this. You arrived at an agreement with us. Now don't go and do something on your own. So it wasn't the ecumenical agreement itself, but the kind of incoherence of the Anglican Communion that caused the difficulty in this case.
Just going back to the Lutheran agreement, if you can talk to it, could you tell us what they agreed to, justification by faith, and also what are the outstanding difficulties with the Lutherans and Catholics?
Yeah. What they agreed to is actually summed up very well in a little book that Pope Benedict XVI wrote called Paul of Tarsus, in which he said, among other things, of course, that Luther, when he translated Romans 3:28, I think it is, for we are justified by faith alone and not by works of the law. Catholic exegetes have been pointing out, Pope Benedict says, that the word alone is not in the text. And he says the exegetes were right to say that the word alone is not in the text. But he says Luther gets the sense right. And there are many Catholic prayers, many of our collects on Sundays that say that we are justified simply by God's grace and the work of Christ. But Pope Benedict then goes on to say he refers to another scripture passage that was crucial at the time of the Reformation from Galatians 5, where it talks about faith working out in love, or faith working out in charity. And he says these two have to be held together. And that is also, of course, the teaching of the letter of James. So, what the Lutheran agreement does is to point out, first of all, that Catholic documents like the Council of Trent also say that we are justified by faith, and that there were early agreements among the kind of nascent Protestants and the Catholics as early as the 16th century, the Regensburg Agreement, for instance, where Catholics and Protestants came to an agreement about the nature of justification. And even Calvin accepted the agreement. But unfortunately, Luther did not. And the powers that be were not minded to support the agreement. So it's building on all of that. behind it is rigorous analysis of the New Testament texts, um, and the doctrinal formulations of both churches. Um, and one of the things it does is to say that the anathemas on both sides do not now apply to what Catholics and Lutherans believe in this matter. The Catholic Church then goes on to say, the Lutherans make their own commitments, but the Catholic Church goes on to say that the doctrine of justification by faith is not just another doctrine. It is a central doctrine by which the Church orients itself to Christ. That's quite a considerable thing for the Church to say about any doctrine, but particularly this one. I think on the Anglican Roman Catholic dialogue, the agreement on the Eucharist is very far reaching and is rooted in patristic doctrine. It's rooted in the New Testament and in the teaching of the Church, but that has now been jeopardized by what has happened regarding Anglican orders. This is also a weakness in the Lutheran agreement, that you can agree about a central doctrine like justification by faith, but if there is no reconciliation of ministries, if there's no agreement about the sacraments, then what use ecclesially is that agreement?
It's somewhat interesting that these foundational disputes, you might say, justification and faith and works and these things, have been patched up, perhaps not perfectly, but somewhat. And then it's subsequent developments which are now the hindrance, which
Yes,
is
the new divisions, yes.
somewhat sad, because everyone would typically think if we could heal the original problems, everything would be sorted. But as time goes on, other issues crop up. So
yes, and some of those, of course, are moral issues that are facing the Western world in particular, which are new causes of division. There are then other questions like the ordination of women to the priesthood unilaterally, which, as I was saying, 3 successive popes asked certainly the Anglican Communion not to do this on their own, but their pleas were unheeded, I have to say, and as you know.
Could you tell us what particular ecumenical initiatives you were involved in and what your hopes and disappointments have been in this regard? You've already touched on them, but if you could expand some more.
Yeah, well, I was a long-standing member of the Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission, which was a theological commission. And then I was also a member of another Anglican Roman Catholic commission, which was about practical steps in working together. Those two certainly. In Pakistan, there was quite a lot of work done about the churches working together vis-a-vis the human rights and the fundamental freedom situation and the persecution of Christians. I was heavily involved in that. I have led interreligious dialogues ecumenically, if you see what I mean, so that from the Christian side, with Muslims and others. So in a whole number of ways, and I've always been interested in the particular questions that divided the churches in the past, whether in the 5th century over the nature of Christ, or then about the creed and with the Eastern Orthodox churches, and then at the Reformation. And I've been very pleased to see how the Catholic Church has committed itself to principled ecumenism. I think that's the term I would use, principled ecumenism, so that you're willing to recognize truth where it exists, but without compromising on principle. So, for instance, with the 5th century controversies about the nature of Christ, the Catholic Church now recognizes that those people who were previously called Monophysite, actually their doctrine about the Blessed Trinity and about the nature of Christ is the same as the Catholic Church, although articulated differently. And the Catholic Church has said the same about the Assyrian Church of the East, the so-called Nestorians, that their doctrine also is or can be in conformity with Catholic faith and Catholic truth, and that even their Eucharist, which is a very ancient liturgy and does not have the words of the institution, uh, is a valid Eucharist according to the Catholic point of view, because although it does not have the words of the institution in a particular place, there are scattered references to it throughout the liturgy. Um, yeah, I mean, with the Orthodox, you remember Pope Benedict saying that nothing would be demanded of the Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox, that is to say, in unity with the Catholic Church, that was not believed in the first millennium.
That's an interesting point. I didn't know that, but it has occurred
Yeah.
to me since the Great Schism. I thought the Catholic Church in particular has come along doctrinally in terms of its its Marian dogmas and other things. And I was wondering, to what extent would we expect the Orthodox to agree to that? So you think it's possible to arrive at communion, but they could, in theory, deny the Immaculate Conception, or how would
Well,
it
they
work?
don't, of course. I mean, the Orthodox don't deny it. I mean, so I think the definition of the dogma was really saying that this is what the church has always believed. I mean, if you define a dogma, that doesn't mean it's something new. It is, you're saying that you are making clear what the church has always believed. The same is true of the assumption that the definition of the dogma is very, very careful not to say how the assumption happened, because, as you know, in the Orthodox and Eastern Catholic traditions, there's also this business about the dormition, falling asleep of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And the question is whether the assumption happens after she's fallen asleep or before. And the dogma, I think, leaves that question open. It doesn't foreclose on that. So I think that would be the answer. I mean, take transubstantiation, that although the Orthodox don't use the term, their belief is the same. And I think it's Paul VI in Mysterium Fidei. He says that the belief about transubstantiation can be expressed in other ways, and the concern would be whether it is the same belief. So I think on that basis, yes, I think Pope Benedict's remark was quite a careful one.
Yeah, because I could see there being a greater scope then for reconciliation if they don't have to go all in and accept all the definitional things, so long as there's a shared faith in the substance of what's being said.
Yes, I think the papal office might be one that continues to divide, because whilst the Orthodox accept the Bishop of Rome as primus inter pares, first among equals, the question of immediate universal jurisdiction would be something they would not accept as things are. However, I mean, immediate universal jurisdiction was exercised even in the first millennium. For example, the tome of Leo in relation to Chalcedon, that about the nature of Christ. It was the arrival of the tome of Leo that settled the matter amongst the churches, the Eastern churches, as well as the West. And if immediate universal jurisdiction just means that in certain circumstances the Bishop of Rome has to intervene to settle a matter of faith, then, I mean, if that is not agreed, then what would be the point of agreeing a universal primacy at all?
Yeah. So, Monsignor, you were received into the Catholic Church in 2021 and ordained to the Catholic priesthood. Could you describe your journey into, or from Anglicanism into the Catholic Church? What troubled you about the direction of Anglicanism, and what was it that finally prompted you to cross the Tiber?
Yes, I mean, the Anglican claim that attracted me was that it was possible to be Catholic without being Roman Catholic. But then I began to see that what the Anglican communion was doing, and particular churches within it, was not consistent with what it means to be a Catholic. I mean, for example, the universality of the church, by which is meant not just its geographical extension, but also continuity through the ages. And this, there was a claim, there is a claim by many of the churches in the Anglican Communion of provincial autonomy. Well, of course, in some ways, local churches do have some kind of autonomy about deciding matters that pertain to them, but it's not absolute. It never has been. And there's always been the concern for fellowship amongst the churches, for communion amongst the churches, for settling disputes through the meeting of councils like Nicaea or Chalcedon, so many, and also through the intervention of the Bishop of Rome, as I was just saying, with the Tome of Leo, for instance, or the date of Easter. So to deny that and to claim a kind of radical autonomy for themselves seemed to me to be very un-Catholic, regardless of the issues that were being faced. But then, on the question of the ordination of women to the priesthood and then the episcopate, as I was saying, the Catholic Church, in dialogue with the Anglican Communion about the restoration of sacramental unity, pleaded with them not to do this unilaterally, and they still did it. Then there was the ordination of someone in a practicing homophile relationship uh, who was also a divorced man and had a history of addiction to the episcopate without consultation with ecumenical partners. Caused an uproar, I mean, not just with the Catholic Church, but with the Orthodox churches as well. And the Orthodox churches, differently from the Catholic Church, had been prepared, at least some of them, to accept Anglicanism as a kind of Western Orthodoxy. Well, that was put paid to by these developments. Now we have differences about the gender identity issue, on questions like abortion, even, and maybe even coming up assisted dying. You think, well, whatever the rights and wrongs of these issues, you can't decide them on your own in your own little corner. That is not being Catholic. So I began to see that this claim to Catholicity was not sound. With the Orthodox churches, I mean, the Orthodox churches, of course, retain much of the historic faith of the church. But it's the Catholicity, it's the universality that very often they're so ethnically tightly defined that the universality of the church then suffers because of that. I mean, just to give you an example, I was in Bosnia during the civil war there, uh, trying to provide relief, along with Islamic relief as it happens, to people regardless of their confession. And I remember asking Orthodox leaders about how they saw their role. And it was invariably, the answer was in terms of the ethnic background of that particular church. When I went to Croatia, which was also involved in the conflict, of course, whatever the Croatians were doing, and not all of that can be excused, because they were mainly Catholic, they knew there was a wider church out there, to which, to some extent, they were accountable. And I find this again and again. The very leading person in the Catholic Church about some development in the West said to me, "I'm so thankful that we have to refer to someone outside this country about these matters." And I think that is right. I think one of the functions of the Bishop of Rome is to reflect what the universal church has always believed and believes now. That's St. Augustine saying, "I believe the gospel because of the Catholic Church." That is exactly right.
If I may, it occurs to me in conversations that I've had, the Catholic view of the formation of the Anglican Church always goes to Henry VIII on the issue of marriage and annulment and divorce, and so the Catholics kind of are scandalized by the origins of the Anglican Church, but then Anglicans seem to take a different view. Could you tell us how the Anglicans see that situation and how they make peace with it?
Well, I was Bishop of Rochester, of course, as an Anglican, and that was the see of St. John Fisher, who was, of course, one of the leading advocates for Queen Catherine in the dispute with Henry. It was quite a technical dispute, actually. I mean, it was, there were two different passages of scripture that were being used by each side. And the theological question was one of whether a papal dispensation was possible or not in this case. So, of course, Henry's subsequent behavior showed what kind of person he was. But at that time, I mean, Henry had just been awarded the title Defender of the Faith by the Pope himself. So he was respected. I mean, he was regarded as a theologian in his own right. So I think that, I mean, what triggered it was certainly the great matter of the king, as it was called at the time. But there were movements for reform from the continent already coming into England. We can't deny that. I mean, Tyndale's translation of the Bible, for instance, and the influence of Reformed and Lutheran theology in the universities of Cambridge and Oxford. I mean, this was happening. And what Henry did with his break with Rome was to permit and encourage these movements to take a hold. Although Henry never himself became a Protestant. I mean, Henry always, in his own mind and his own practice, remained a Catholic. He did not allow any Protestant practices to come into the Church of England, of which he had claimed to be the supreme head. That happened afterwards. That happened under Edward, his son, who didn't live very long, and then also to some extent under Elizabeth. Yeah, I mean, I think you have to see this in the context of the Reformation itself on the continent. Its widespread influence in Germany, in Switzerland, in Scandinavia, and also to a great extent in France at one time. So the question is, if Henry had not existed, would this have happened anyway? We don't know the answer to that question. I think what you can lay at Henry's door is schism, certainly that, but I think particular Protestant doctrinal formulations, the influence on the liturgy of the church, and things like that came later.
Okay. So, besides ecumenical concerns, we've already touched on interreligious dialogue. I'd like to go back to that if we may. And interreligious dialogue, especially between Muslims and Christians. Can you tell us a bit about the differences between Sunni and Shia Islam and what gave rise to the radical Islamism that we see asserting itself in Europe?
Well, Shia and Sunni Islam, yeah. I mean, Sunni Islam is really a religion of the book in a quite a strict sense. It has no kind of central living authority as such. And so everything goes by what the Quran teaches and what the traditions of the Prophet teach in interpretation of the Quran. I mean, that is the basis for the elaboration, for example, of Sharia, of Islamic law, um, and of understanding what the faith demands of believers and so on. Shia Islam, on the other hand, works on the basis of a living tradition that is mediated through the descendants of the Prophet himself and their representatives. So in Iran, for example, the claim by Ayatollah Khomeini was that he, because of his learning, was a representative of the absent imam or leader, because they are awaiting the return of that imam who's a descendant of the Prophet. And as his representative, he could enforce with full authority what he understood to be a kind of Shia theocracy. And that is still the basis for the state in a country like Iran. But that's the main difference. I mean, there are all sorts of other differences in practice that have emerged in terms of the laws of marriage or the laws of treating non-Muslims, um, and the way in which prayer is offered and so on. But that's the main difference.
Mm-hmm. Is there I don't know, can you really say that there's one's a more moderate form than the other, or is that too simplistic?
No, it can't be done like that. I think there are moderate forces within each camp. So there are moderate forces, opinions, people, attitudes within Sunni Islam, and moderate opinions and people within Shia Islam. So many of the claims of um, theocracy by Khomeini were opposed by Shia divines themselves. Similarly, in Sunni Islam, there have been reformers like Muhammad Abdu in Egypt, or Muhammad Iqbal in Pakistan, what was then British India, who upheld the possibility of development in the law of Sharia, for instance, to bring it into conformity with contemporary conditions, and also on questions like democracy. So there is, quite a lot of that that exists. The problem has been that in the last, say, 40 years or so, for various geopolitical reasons, extremist interpretations have come to the fore, and the moderate voices have not been heard.
And are there any particular reasons why, I suppose, in Britain, and you see in France and Germany and Scandinavia, you see almost a segregation occurring, and no-go zones and other things like that? Can you give us some explanation for maybe the dynamics that have given rise to that?
Yes, I have myself drawn attention to this. I think there are a number of reasons. Certainly, as far as Britain is concerned, one of the reasons is this secularist doctrine of multiculturalism. So rather than saying to people who are coming to live in this country, this is who we are, our laws and our customs, our way of life has been formed by the Judeo Christian tradition at its broadest. And to engage with them on that basis, to engage in dialogue with them, to uh, engage with hospitality, but to be clear about the basis for that engagement. Rather than doing that, what was said was uh, there is some kind of tabula rasa. Uh, we don't know who we are or where we've come from. We certainly don't know who you are. So let us just tolerate one another and live as we choose to. So, what they did then under this doctrine of multiculturalism, for example, was to foster strong communities coming into existence by financing community centers, not insisting on English as a lingua franca, providing facilities for people of one community rather than for uh, making sure that different communities engage with one another, schools that were 99% of people from one community, um, that kind of thing. So it has caused segregation. And of course, uh, this was seen as an opportunity by extremist elements, extremism that was getting stronger in the Middle East, financed by petrodollars very often, and by geopolitical policies of Western and Middle Eastern countries. And they saw this as an opportunity to take root here, uh, which they which they have done in a whole number of ways. So, in the very early 70s, a Pakistani researcher did some research on the Pakistani Muslim community in this country, in Britain, and discovered that most of them believed in a kind of Sufi Islam, a devotional Islam. Uh, they were, of course, mostly at that time men. The families had not come. By the late 80s, the situation had changed completely from believing in a kind of practicing a kind of Sunni Islam to the mosques generally being run by very, very conservative and sometimes extremist elements. Of course, there are many people here in Britain, and I dare say in Germany and France as well, many Muslims who are moderate and who want to integrate and who want to contribute and do contribute to the wider community, but their voices are often drowned out by the extremists. So we need to hear those voices a lot. But I think also in terms of government policy, we need policies that encourage social mobility, that encourage integration. Integration does not mean assimilation. And there are communities here, the Huguenots who came from France, for instance, or the Jews who have come at different times to this country, or the East African Asians, both Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, and Christians, have integrated well here whilst also remaining distinctive in their culture and their religious practices and so on. So it's quite possible to do this, it's not impossible. But multiculturalism has certainly exacerbated our difficulties.
Yeah. Would you were saying at the beginning of your response that there's more or less a vacuum that's been filled. There was no self-confident home culture, let's say. In terms of I suppose, combating a very assertive form of Islam. Would you say it's necessary for England, let's say, to recover its Christian faith if it's going to be able to combat this problem?
It's not only for that reason. I mean, I think there are many other reasons that you have to give an account. Every government has to give an account of itself in moral terms. And where is that going to come from? So let's take an example that keeps recurring, which is the justification of conflict. Now, whatever we may say about it, when the debate begins about whether British participation in a particular conflict is justified or not, you have to, unless you're a radical pacifist, people I respect, by the way, but unless you are a radical pacifist, the discussion has to begin with the Christian doctrine of the just war. It may not end there, but that's where it has to begin. Similarly, with questions about the family or about the question about when is there a human being and what are the protections due to a human being, the discussion has to begin with the Christian tradition. I mean, secular historians are now saying that what the Western world believes about humanity has largely been derived from the Judeo-Christian tradition as developed by the churches and propagated by the churches. So how are you going to decide these matters without any reference to Christian views about humanity, about protection due to those who are weakest, about the justification of conflict? I mean, there are so many things about justice for the poor, generosity to those who need our generosity, and so on.
Yeah. So the Labour government in Britain is presently considering a bill to decriminalise Islamophobia. Are you concerned about this bill, and if so, why?
Yes, I am concerned because the first thing is that already in the human rights legislation, religion is a protected characteristic. So that means people's religious beliefs are protected and they cannot be discriminated against because of their religious beliefs. That is already the case in law. Of course, there can be practical action taken on preventing hatred of Muslims uh, and indeed hatred of Jews, or hatred or animosity or discrimination against Christians. But what we cannot have is a blasphemy law by the back door. So there must be freedom of speech to criticize any religion, to applaud and to criticize any religion, including Christianity, of course. I keep saying again and again, I'm very happy to hear criticism of this or that Christian belief or action, as long as we are given the possibility of replying to it. So nothing can be done in law that diminishes that freedom of belief, of expression, of speech. At the same time, I am conscious that we need to promote civility in public discourse. That even when we are critical of something or someone, or of a system, or of a religion, it has to be done and should be done respectfully, and not provocatively, not insultingly, And all of this can and should be done and is done by people. So I don't think there's any need for such a bill myself.
A fellow convert, Dr. Gavin Ashenden, recently
Yeah.
predicted that Britain will soon be divided into Islamic and non-Islamic areas. Some people that might strike them as a bit extreme, but do you agree with that assessment? And what are your thoughts about the situation more generally?
Well, I think what we must be on guard about is segregation of communities for whatever reason, whether it is culture or faith, um, and government should be promoting interaction amongst communities. Uh, for instance, in education, I think we need schools with a greater mix of people. Higher education, I mean, one of the things that the proliferation of universities has done in this country is to allow people to go to university fairly locally. Well, one unintended consequence of this is that they never leave their community. So, in mobility in higher education, mobility in employment, all of these things will prevent the kind of segregation that is undoubtedly already occurring
Hmm.
and has been. I mean, it's not just Gavin or myself saying this. I mean, this has been noted by people appointed by the government themselves to consider this question.
Yeah. Another question. I've heard it said that in early Christianity, it was particularly women who embraced the gospel because it was a particularly liberating message for them.
Mm.
And there are people who would think that there would be messages in the gospel that would also appeal to Muslim women a great
Yeah.
deal. So I was wondering, what aspects of Christianity do you think would be particularly attractive to them?
Well, Christian teaching on marriage, for example.
Hmm.
So, when I've been officiating at weddings where Muslim women have been present, I'm sometimes asked by them, when it says one man and one woman for life, um, do you really mean that? I say yes, because this is God's intention from the beginning. For this cause a man shall leave father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And not only that, but this was reaffirmed by Jesus in his teaching, and the church has continually taught this, the permanence of a one man, one woman relationship for life. This is very good news for them because, of course, they always live under the threat of divorce, unilateral divorce by their husbands. Um, and marriage is seen as a contract that can be brought to an end in particular circumstances, sometimes by the women themselves, not in the same way as the men, but through a different procedure. So the idea that there is here a permanent relationship that is being created is seen by them as good news.
So you've mentioned Iran in passing, and it takes my interest because I've seen reports that Christianity is surging there. And I was wondering, because you would know better than I, whether this is true, and if so, what do you know about the situation?
It is true. I mean, the reasons for it are very complex. I think the paradox is that since the Islamic Revolution, there are now more Farsi speaking Christians in Iran and in the world generally than there have ever been before in history. One of the reasons is that many people in Iran now have experienced the kind of strict theocracy uh, since 1979, and they don't like it. Um, they are a spiritual people, so they don't want to give up spiritual belief. And Christianity, in terms of house churches, in terms of social media and other media, provides for them a way of expressing their spirituality without opting into this kind of theocratic interpretation of religion. I think that's the main reason why it has grown so much. But the fact that Christian leaders are continually being imprisoned even today, and house churches being broken up, uh, is a sign that the powers that be there see Christian growth as a threat. But it is to be seen in the context of a wider disillusionment with theocracy. Uh, that there is some of it leads to just not practicing faith at all. Some of it leads to even to atheism, and maybe other expressions of faith other than Christianity.
It strikes me that nowadays the majority of evangelization in those countries, so the missionaries, are Protestant, no longer really Catholic.
Yes.
Um, what are the, I suppose, structural difficulties that the Catholic Church has in terms
Mm.
of evangelizing those cultures?
Yeah, the Catholic Church did produce a very fine, the Franciscans, I think, produced it, a very fine Life of Christ in Farsi some years ago, which has been widely used, not just by the Catholic Church, but by many others in Iran. But there is a Chaldean Rite Catholic Church in Iran, and that has to be protected. It is recognized by the government, and the Catholic Church has to be careful that its situation is not compromised, difficult as it is. I think the Catholic Church has provided protection for people who have not been Catholics, whose situation might have been worse if that had not happened. And evangelization is a process. You can provide materials, you can provide reasons for people to come to faith in Christ. And I think we will see a growing number of people from that kind of background who may initially have come to faith in some other way, becoming Catholics because of their cultural background.
So you think that there's kind of a complementarity between the, say, Iranian traditional Iranian culture and Catholicism in particular? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I think there is. I think the formality in worship, for instance, the great use of scripture in during the context of corporate worship, the use of posture in worship, the sacramental aspects of the Catholic Church. I think these would naturally appeal to Iranian and many Middle Eastern people generally.
Yeah. Just it occurred to me. So is it the Azerbaijanis? No, it's the Armenians. Goodness me, I'll get in trouble.
Yes, yes,
The Armenians are suffering quite a bit of persecution. For those who
yes.
don't know, can you fill us in on what the situation is there, and maybe some historical context? I'm not sure if that's in your field, but I feel like they're a
Hmm.
really neglected group, and they deserve to have some attention brought to them.
Yes, Christian Solidarity International, which works from Switzerland, are working very closely with with Armenia and the Armenian people about the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh. But yeah, the Armenians have a long history of persecution within the Ottoman Empire itself, after the First World War, particularly. But since then, and then in the Soviet Union, now in this conflict with Azerbaijan, in Iran, they are a recognized minority group. Um, and whilst they are restricted in many different ways, their situation has not been as dire as those in the house churches.
Yeah, I don't know much about the Armenians, but I have a big soft spot for them because I'm a big fan of Irenaeus, and they're the only ones who kept a copy of Demonstration of the Apostolic Preaching, which is like a long lost
Yes,
work. So
Well, yes, and liturgically, I mean, there are many riches there in the Armenian and the Ethiopian churches that other parts of the church have lost. And I think we owe them a debt for that, definitely.
So, Monsignor, you've long had a concern for the poor. Can you tell us about any initiatives you've been involved in? And are there any initiatives you can recommend to those watching?
Yes, certainly. I think with the poor, one of the things that I'm doing at the moment, in a very small way, is to make sure that Christian young people in persecuted um, situations are able to undertake and to finish vocational and professional qualifications. And I found that in many situations, a very small amount of money can enable them to do that. I didn't do this intentionally. I mean, this just happened, as it were, as so many of these things do. I think the other area in which, certainly with the persecuted church and young people themselves have asked, is to enable them to set up in small business. So, micro enterprise. I know that in Australia you have Opportunity International uh, doing this work. A micro enterprise is something that is quite crucial, and many people are now engaged in this. This is happening, for example, with the Christians settling back in Nineveh on the plains of Nineveh in Iraq. Yeah, bonded labor. I've had some experience of working with them, of somehow showing them how they can escape this bonded condition. It is possible to do, but it is very difficult because the problem is not just those who are oppressing them, those who have bonded them, as it were, into their uh, enterprise, but the people themselves who feel their only skill is doing this kind of work and they're very reluctant, therefore, to leave it. So it's a uh, long-term thing that we have to engage in.
Finally, Monsignor, how can people keep up to speed with your work or see your published books?
Yes, I have a website which we try to keep up to date. You know what the problem is with websites, certainly with writing and so on. And I write newsletters from time to time. Um, but some of the work is sensitive and you can't always publicize it. It'd be counterproductive to do so.
Yeah. Okay, and just a quick plug for the Thomas More Centre. If you could like, share, and subscribe to our channel, that will help us grow. Monsignor Michael Nazir-Ali, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much indeed. Bless you.